Thank you. There are 4 leadership concepts that I want to talk about today, and I would suggest that these 4 leadership concepts can double the chances that your Agile transformation will be effective and stay that way. There are these 4 concepts really aren't new, but they require a degree of passion and constancy of purpose that are often missing. And that word constancy is really important. For those of you who have read Out of the Crisis by MIT Press by Deming, you'll know that constancy of purpose was his first point in his 14 points of management. Deming, I would suggest, his philosophies form the bedrock for the Agile and Lean revolution that we're currently engulfed in. So I would suggest that ignoring Deming, you do so at your own peril. Ignoring constancy of purpose leads organizations, leads people to point to leaders and say, the change of the month club. And that really robs, most change programs of any possibility of fundamentally helping people to do better, to gain more value from the work that they provide. The 4 cornerstones that are critical when defining Agile leadership are a focus on behavior, setting the bar high, developing self-awareness, and deploying measurement. Those 4 things, if you do them well, really, I think, create a scenario where you are truly an Agile leader. Now, obviously, there's a few more slides in here, but if you take anything away, those 4 are the critical takeaways. A focus on behavior is truly incredibly important, and that's why I want to talk about this first. Simply put, you are what you do. And that might feel like I'm spouting New Age philosophy, but frankly, I think when you define and explicitly state how you want people to behave, in addition to expressing values you want emulated, you are really telling people what that means. Behaviors are really the true window of the soul and a direct reflection of how an individual interprets values and culture. Nearly every change leader, and you'll hear this in the Agile Manifesto, you'll hear this from everyone. Every change leader understands, or at least will state, that values and culture are critical. And Agile pundits, practitioners are no different. We generally expound on the core Agile values. We talk about them, things like empowerment, management, alignment, transparency, building in quality, shifting left. All of these values we place at the core of Agile. The disconnect, though, and this is where it becomes critically important, that disconnect often occurs between how each person in the value chain translates their own definitions of value into behavior. Strong Agile leaders focus on behaviors as the immutable translation of values and culture. And I love that word, immutable, because very frankly, values are really cheap if they're just words. You are what you do. And one of the principles in the Agile Manifesto is that the only real measure of progress is functional code. I would suggest the only real measure of values is how people behave. A quick example of the disconnect between espoused values and behavior. I have a tendency to actually ask people questions and to try to peer into how people are behaving. I have performed an informal poll in organizations that promote empowerment as one of their primary values over the past year. In almost every case, I'll walk through the hall and I'll ask someone, what's the best example of empowerment? And I'm typically greeted by that classic deer in the headlights look. Oh my, why is this person talking to me? Oh my, what am I going to say? Every person I asked had a difficult time remembering an example. So consider this. After the webinar is over, think about if you talk in your organization about the value of empowerment. When was the last example of someone being truly empowered? I would suggest that there's very little linkage in many organizations between, values and day-to-day behavior. In a few cases, by the way, when I press people on examples, and obviously the goal wasn't to make people uncomfortable, but when you would press people, what really emerged was that oh yes, someone was allowed to make rules that disempowered someone else. In many cases, when we define values, or at least when we think about examples of things like empowerment, we're almost wrestling with this as if it's a zero-sum game. If I'm empowered, somebody else has to be disempowered. The values you exhibit through the behavior, your behavior, matter more than what you say in words. And that's critical for an Agile manager. As an example of organizations that aren't in IT, and I know we're talking IT today, and I think this is why it's important to reflect on other organizations. Recently, I ran across a great story, and hopefully someday I'll be able to tell it on the podcast. But this is an example of an organization that embraced Agile values in terms of using things like telling stories and generating user stories as a mechanism. And they went through, and this is in the education world. So these are teachers and process people within the teachers' organizations learning Agile. So they created this mechanism of attempting to take beliefs and then decomposing those into values and actions in teaching. And they walk through this process. And I won't take you through it in great detail, but very frankly, they were able to take people down through a set of steps as leaders and then get these sub-leaders, teachers, who actually lead their individual classrooms to actually craft out a backlog of what they need to do to actually accomplish the goals in their class. As a matter of fact, and I'll reach over here and grab this, last night I got an email because I was conversing with these folks, and the email was, the last teacher we met with, she said she got goosebumps on the power of this with students. Her wheels were turning so fast that it was very energizing. So we know there's something here. We, as Agile leaders, can take those behaviors that we're using and actually leverage them up and down. We can unlock how people behave. But to do that, I think we have to start wrestling with translating individual items into words. For example, how do you define the term customer satisfaction? How does, is it individuals that we are attempting to satisfy? Is it other stakeholders? How do we actually make that happen in the real world? Transparency is one of those wonderful items that I think most of us in the Agile world hold and say this is an important part of how we have to work. We need to be able to share, but who are we really sharing to? And one of the, again, here's where there's a disconnect with behavior. We talk about product owners, and product owners truly should be from the business, but that means bringing them inside of our group. So we tend to proxy those out. So we have a problem with real product owners because we don't invite them in. We can't be transparent because we haven't defined what that word is, and then therefore we can't truly embrace